On this question of open source, Ilkka, this is your domain. What does Linux have to teach us, particularly around issues of that boundary between openness and a kernel that's locked down, which, were it open, would lead to complete chaos. So kind of the question is, what does Linux have to teach the educational community, and are there places where that analogy breaks down?
In a way, it links to Richard's earlier point on standardization. That I was looking the history of Linux, the source code, how it actually evolved, and what happened during the history of its evolution. And what was kind of rather apparent from the beginning is that some parts of the system were kind of frozen very early in the process. They emerged simply empirically, looking how much there is changes in the different parts of the system architecture. This is software operating system. So looking where there is change going on, you could see that at some point, some parts of the system became some kind of a kernel, core of this much more complex system. And by freezing the interfaces, in a way standardizing the interfaces in this core, the community was able to keep on innovating at the more peripheral areas of this system. But if you would change the core all the time, there would be no kind of solid basis for coordinating work across these different kind of development areas. So that's why I'm saying that innovation requires a careful balance between change and stability. That is not only the case in Linux, by the way, because in organization business strategy and organization literature, we also know that if you run your company either as a research lab or as a pure manufacturer, you will fail, because you have to have these both in a real working business. So you have to kind of separate, sometimes build walls between these different types of processes in organizations to make it kind of go on. So if you go and keep on innovating in those kind of core processes which are really efficiency oriented, you create chaos. And on the other hand, if you don't innovate in those processes which are supposed to renew the organization, you fail, you die out. So there is also this need to balance that.
Yeah. Richard, you wanted to interject?
I just wanted to jump in on that and amplify a little bit on this the question of where does the analogy, how does the analogy work or break down between textbooks, open educational resources, all these, and Linux, right? Software.
Yeah.
And I let me give a sort of alternate kind of viewpoint of this, and I think that it definitely breaks down because if you get right down to it, Linux software, right, which is licensed under the GPL, is truly open for everyone to use, right, including commercial entities. So the ecosystem is allowed to include not just universities, individuals, but also large companies, right? And you might ask the question of where would Linux be without Red Hat, right? At a certain point in 1999, the company, for-profit company Red Hat, employed fully 50% of the world's Linux programmers. So they lived in a symbiotic relationship, a for-profit company in a $3 billion business today, living in a symbiotic relationship with a thing that's completely open source. One of the things I'm really bothered about in the education world is this use of openness and yet non-commercial licenses around that openness. And I think that this is really dangerous, personally, and connections also things that this is dangerous. And the reason is that it basically shuts out a very large part of the potential ecosystem, right? Namely, all those commercial concerns that do things like print, that do things like build web homework systems, publishers, et cetera. A lot of these entities would really like to get involved in the open education resources movement, but they feel shut out, or they actually are explicitly due to non-commercial licensing. And I think this is actually dangerous, because it means we're trying to set up an alternate universe from any universe that involves the private sector, and that ultimately this is going to come to some kind of showdown or fighting in the streets, if you will, over textbooks. And so I would like to see more projects adopting a more ecosystem-based, commercially usable license, that much in sort of along the same lines as open source software.
Critical consideration, and this is a case where the most open license, the GPL, what Richard's referring to is the fact that when you contribute into a GPL project, anything you contribute inherits that license. So these are also talked about as copy left. They preclude the sort of openness that you have with a MIT or BSD license, where you can contribute into this and not worry about your ability to create. Now, if you raise this topic in any OER mailing list, you better watch your inbox, because this is what really gets passions heated. So while we're in agreement, Richard, or maybe this will spark a few tweets coming out of the online audience. But I'd like to shift a little from theory to practice, and put a question to Catherine. Catherine, you're our embodiment of practice here on this panel, as the one who's doing the work. So Catherine, I wonder if you could provide some practical examples about how institutional policy might influence whether OER actually becomes an integral part of how educational institutions do their business. What are the barriers there, and what are some examples of successes or failures that you've been involved in?
This morning, Her Royal Highness spoke of education as an imperative, and in the developing world, all across the developing world, it is an imperative. It's not something that we can put off until tomorrow. And in the areas of health, teacher education, agriculture, foundation courses, which are the areas in which OER Africa works, the use of open educational resources is critical. What is happening to higher education institutions across the continent, and probably in other developing countries as well, is that the numbers of students are growing. The faculty are probably growing older. We heard in an earlier panel that many faculty who have remained on the continent or in the developing world and not chosen to join those in the diaspora, for example, are not trained up to the levels that they would wish to be, or that they should be. And that, of course, impacts then on the quality of the education that is possible in those circumstances. And faculty are very, very well aware of that. And so where an institutional policy comes in is possibly around things like materials development, and how much recognition a higher education institution is willing to give to teaching and learning. Universities in Africa, as in anywhere else, talk about teaching and learning as an integral part of their mandate, but really what they're really, really interested in is research and innovation and those kinds of things, outreach. And if you're going to encourage improved teaching and learning practices, if you're going to be in a position where faculty are not obliged to be delivering the curriculum through a lecture because there are not enough other means for students to get their hands on resources, then the sorts of things that Ilka was talking about, passion, become very important. Those faculty who are interested in developing resources that their students can use outside of classroom time, engage with them. I can give you a few examples of that. For example, at a university in Ghana, faculty in the Faculty of Health worked with staff in the School of Fine Arts, which seems like a very unlikely marriage. But what happened there is they decided they would develop DVDs. And DVDs are portable. Students have laptops, some of them. They have access to computer labs, even if they don't have access to their own personal laptop. They can take this thing, they can go with it, they can sit with it. But what was important was that they were working with the School of Fine Arts for the visuals. So that it was something that was not just educationally sound, which certainly a doctor and a surgeon could guarantee, but was something that actually looked the way it was supposed to look. And then, of course, if you're shooting a video and you are the professor who's been teaching these students for the last 2 years or the last year or so, then it's your voice that the students are hearing, and that also makes a difference. And they were able to report that students who were able to interact with DVDs, say on a cesarean section or a live birth or something like that, were operating and engaging at a far higher level than previous cohorts at the same level who hadn't had access to such resources. It also then, of course, freed up the time of the lecturers to be doing other stuff because they weren't delivering the same lecture week after week, month after month, and they could now, for example, engage with discussions with their students. And it seems like a very small thing, but when you're operating in an environment where you're trying to lecture in an auditorium that was designed for 100 students, and you have 600 students, you have 1,000 students, they can't see, they can't hear. The need for another way of doing things is imperative. What an institution can do then is to recognize that sort of work, to reward the fact that faculty have used their time to develop resources, to block off that time for people to do that, to recognize, whether it's simply through an award ceremony, a public recognition, even if it's not money, what it is that faculty are doing. In some of the institutions that we've worked in, the development of peer-reviewed OER that have gone through the whole system is recognized as at the same level as a contribution to a peer-reviewed journal. These are the sorts of policies that institutions can put into place that will actually encourage their faculty to get involved in OER, because otherwise why would they do it? What it also does then is to create a space for looking at what are the other sorts of skills that faculty need to have if they're going to be engaged in the OER movement in any sort of meaningful way. When you're hired as faculty, you're hired as on the basis of your subject matter expertise. You're not hired, nobody asks you if you're a great teacher. You never had to acquire pedagogical skills to get that post in the first place. So that's something that policies can look into. If you have never had broadband, if it takes 5, 10, 50 minutes to open an email, you are never going to surf the web. You're just not going to do it because that is not the way you're going to choose to use your time. If you don't use your time that way, you're not necessarily going to learn the way that some of us have learned how to use a search engine by trial and error, because you never had that opportunity. And so, again, if you have an institutional policy that insists that faculty will be provided with a laptop, they will have connectivity provided by the institution, and they will be facilitated and supported in using it, so that you're not being made to feel foolish about it if you've never done it before, but that the IT department's role also changes from simply being the guys who provide the hardware and service it, to actually walking you through, these are the kinds of things you can do that might be of benefit to you if you're interested in using educational technology in your classes. So these are the sorts of things that we've been doing in universities. At a national level, of course, policy has a different dimension. And if governments are not aligning educational policy to the particular needs of their countries, if they are still operating as though it's still 1972, it's not very useful. And going back to the drawing board and thinking about what is it that we want our educational system to do, and therefore what are the sorts of skills that we need in the areas of health, in the areas of agriculture. Why is it that every time there is a drought, there is also famine? And yet we have had institutions of higher education that are supposed to be training agriculturalists and have been doing so for the last 50 years. Why are we still dependent on small-scale farming, and these farmers are not being able to move from the level of subsistence farming or something a bit better to being able to grow enough food that will feed the country and feed their neighboring countries, so that we're not having the sorts of situations that we're having now in Kenya and Somalia, where people are hungry, and we knew that they were going to be.
Learning outcomes measured in terms of the ability for a society to feed itself. Profound. Richard, Catherine, Ilka, thank you so much. Thank you.